Hey guys, and welcome to Story Time. Today's story is one of the stories for Black History Month. This is a person you probably have not heard of unless you've already done the reading comprehension sheet, which tells you a little bit about him, but not a whole lot. His name is Henry. The name of the book is Henry's Freedom Box. It won a Caldecott Award, if you see that. The Caldecott Award means it got the best art of any children's book that was released that year. Now, this is a true story from the Underground Railroad. This is not make believe. This is nonfiction. I'm stressing that because when you hear his story, you might think, oh, this sounds like a fiction story, but it's not. This really happened. Henry Brown wasn't sure how old he was. Henry was a slave, and slaves weren't allowed to know their birthdays. Here's Henry. Henry and his brother and sisters worked in the big house where the master lived. Henry's master had been good to Henry and his family, but Henry's mother knew things could change any minute. Do you see those leaves blowing in the wind? They are torn from trees like slave children are torn from their families. Now, Henry didn't really know what his mom was talking about at this point. I don't think. But unfortunately, he was going to find out. Mom knew that even if you were having a good day, things could change terribly quickly if you were a slave. One morning, the master called for Henry and his mother. They climbed the wide staircase. The master lay in bed with only his head above the quilt. He was very ill. He beckoned them to come closer. Now, sometimes when a master would die, they would free their slaves. Henry's heart was beating faster. He was thinking maybe his master would free him. But the master said, "You've been a good worker, Henry. I am giving you to my son. You must obey him, and you must never tell a lie." Henry nodded, but he didn't say thank you, because that would have been a lie. Now, Henry had no choice in this, neither did his mother. That was one of the many terrible things of being a slave. Later that day, Henry watched a bird soar high above the trees. Free bird and happy bird, he thought. Henry said goodbye to his family. He looked across the field. The leaves were swirling in the wind. So the man's son is here to pick up the slaves that have been given away or given to him. Henry worked in his new master's factory. He was good at his job. "Do not tear that tobacco leaf," the boss yelled at the boy. He poked the boy with a stick. If you made a mistake, the boss would beat you. Now, it's possible that you may have some grandparents that were old enough to work in tobacco. I did when I was a little kid. Nothing like Henry now. I did it with my grandparents. But I can tell you, it's hard work anyway. Henry was lonely, but one day he met Nancy. She was out shopping for her mistress. They walked and talked and agreed to meet again. Henry felt like singing, but of course slaves didn't dare sing. Instead, he just hummed. Now, this is Henry, and he met this person. Now, she was out shopping for her mistress. That's a word, and master too, really, are words that we're not used to using. Master was the word for a man, and mistress meant the same thing, but it was a woman. So that means she was a slave too, and her owner was a woman. Months later, Henry asked Nancy to be his wife. Now, they had to ask both their masters, but they agreed. Henry and Nancy were married. Soon there was a little baby, and another, and another. Henry knew they were very lucky. They lived together even though they had different masters. But Nancy was worried. Her master had lost a great deal of money. "I'm afraid he's going to sell our children to make money," she said. Henry sat very still. There's a whole lot to think about on this page. First off, both Henry and Nancy were adults, but yet they had to ask someone's permission to get married. Then, when her master was running low on money, she was afraid he was going to sell her children to make money. That's horrible. Henry worked hard all morning. He tried to forget what Nancy had said. His friend James came into the factory. He whispered to Henry, "Your wife and your children were just sold into the slave market." "No," cried Henry. Henry couldn't move. He couldn't think. He couldn't work. "Twist that tobacco." The boss poked at Henry. Henry twisted the leaves, but his heart was twisted in his chest. Now imagine that. Imagine being at work, someone coming in and whispering to you, your children were just sold, and then having to stay at work, and them expecting you to continue to work just as well. At lunchtime, Henry rushed to the center of town. A large group of slaves were tied together. The owner shouted at him. Henry looked for his family. "Father, father!" Henry watched his children disappear down the road. Where was Nancy? He saw her the same moment she saw him. When he wiped away his tears, Nancy was gone too. So here's Henry. Here's his family being sold. Henry no longer sang. He couldn't even hum. He went to work during the day, and at night he went to sleep. Henry tried to think of happy times, but all he could see were the carts carrying everyone he loved away. Henry knew he would never see them again. Many weeks passed. One morning, Henry heard a singing little bird out of a tree, and Henry thought about being free. But how? He lifted a crate, and he came up with the answer. He asked James and Dr. Smith to help him. Dr. Smith was a white man who thought slavery was wrong. They met early the next day in the empty warehouse. Henry arrived with a box. "I will mail myself to a place where there are no slaves," he said. James stared at the box and then Henry. "What if you cough and someone hears you?" "I will cover my mouth and hope." So he's going to mail himself in a box. This is the doctor. And there were white people who thought slavery was absolutely wrong. They were part of the Underground Railroad. Now, they couldn't tell anybody because he would be in trouble as well. Dr. Smith wrote on the box, "To William H. Johnson, Arch Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania." Henry would be delivered to friends in Philadelphia. Then he printed this side up with care. Henry needed an excuse to stay home or work, or the boss would thought he had tried to escape. James pointed to Henry's sore finger, but Henry knew it wasn't enough. He opened up a bottle of oil. "No," cried James. Henry poured it on his hand. It burned the skin to the bone. Now the boss would have to send him home. Dr. Smith bandages his hand, and they arranged to meet the next morning at 4 o'clock. The sun was not yet up when Henry climbed into the box. "Ready," he said. James nailed down the lid. Dr. Smith and James drove to the station. The railway clerk tipped the box over and nailed a paper to the bottom. Dr. Smith begged the clerks to be careful, but they didn't listen. They just threw the box into a car. Hours passed. Henry was lifted up and thrown again, upside down. He heard the waves splashing. That must be the steamboat headed for D.C. The ship rode smoothly, but Henry was still upside down in a box. Blood rushed to his head. His face got hot. His eyes ached, and he thought his head would burst. But he was afraid if he moved, someone would hear him. "I'm tired of standing," someone said. "Why don't we move this box and sit on it?" said another. Henry held his breath. Could they be talking about his box? Henry was pushed. The box scraped the deck. Now he was on his right side and his left. And suddenly he was at least right side up. Poor Henry. It's a terrible time, and yet he can't make any noise. "What do you think it is?" said the first man. "Mail, I guess," said the other. "I'm the mail," thought Henry, but not the kind they imagine. Henry was carried off the steamboat and placed in a railroad car. This time his head was up. He fell asleep. So the whole time, these people have no idea there's a person in that box. He awoke to loud knocking. "Henry, are you all right?" "All right," he answered. The cover was pried open. Henry stretched and stood up. 4 men smiled at him. "Welcome to Philadelphia, Henry." Now, it ends there. But Henry did live out the rest of his life being free. He should have probably not made it. Mailing yourself in a box is a very, very dangerous thing. But he did. Now, he never found his wife and children again. But at least Henry was able to live the rest of his life as a free man. Because in the North, there was no slavery, so he was free. Okay. Let's not forget Henry. Henry Brown had a very important story. Talk soon, guys.